May say where's mine. I don't appear in the business, neither do you. All Snawley's interest is to stick well to the story he has told, and all his risk is to depart from it in the least. Talk of your risk in a conspiracy! I say,' remonstrated Squeers, looking uneasily around, 'don't call it that. Just as a favour, don't.' 'Call it what you like,' said Ralph irritably, 'but attend to me. This tale was originally fabricated as a means of annoyance against one who hurt your trade and half cudgelled you to death, and to enable you to obtain repossession of a half dead drudge whom you wished to regain, because, while you wreaked your vengeance on him for his share in the business, you knew that the knowledge that he was again in your power would be the best punishment you could inflict upon your enemy. Is that so, Mr. Squeers?' 'Why, sir,' returned Squeers, almost overpowered by the determination which Ralph displayed to make everything tell against him, and by his stern, unyielding manner, 'in a measure it was.' 'What does that mean?' said Ralph. 'Why, in a measure means,' returned Squeers, 'as it may be, that it wasn't all on my account, because you had some old grudge to satisfy too.' 'If I had not had,' said Ralph, in no way abashed by the reminder, 'do you think I should have helped you?' 'Why, no, I don't suppose you would,' Squeers replied. 'I only wanted that point to be all square and straight between us.' 'How can it ever be otherwise,' retorted Ralph, 'except that the account is against me? For I spend money to gratify my hatred, and you pocket it, and gratify yours at the same time. You are at least as avaricious as you are revengeful. So am I. Which is best off? You, who win money and revenge at the same time and by the same process, and who are, at all events, sure of money, if not of revenge? Or I, who am only sure of spending money in any case, and can but win bare revenge at last?' As Mr. Squeers could only answer this proposition by shrugs and smiles, Ralph bade him be silent, and thankful that he was so well off; and then, fixing his eyes steadily upon him, proceeded to say: First, that Nicholas had thwarted him in a plan he had formed for the disposal in marriage of a certain young lady, and had, in the confusion attendant on her father's sudden death, secured that lady himself and borne her off in triumph. Secondly, that by some will or settlement, certainly by some instrument in writing, which must contain the young lady's name, and could be therefore easily selected from others if access to the place where it was deposited were once secured, she was entitled to property, which, if the existence of this deed ever became known to her, would make her husband (and Ralph represented that Nicholas was certain to marry her) a rich and prosperous man, and most formidable enemy. Thirdly, that this deed had been, with others, stolen from one who had himself obtained or concealed it fraudulently, and who feared to take any steps for its recovery, and that he, Ralph, knew the thief. To all this Mr. Squeers listened, with greedy ears that devoured every syllable, and with his one eye and his mouth wide open, marvelling for what special reason he was honoured with so much of Ralph's confidence, and to what it all tended. 'Now,' said Ralph, leaning forward and placing his hand on Squeers's arm, 'hear the design which I have conceived, and which I must, I say must, if I can ripen it, have carried into execution. No advantage can be reaped from this deed, whatever it is, save by the girl herself or her husband; and the possession of this deed by one or other of them is indispensable to any advantage being gained. That I have discovered beyond the possibility of doubt. I want that deed brought here, that I may give the man who brings it £50 in gold, and burn it to ashes before his face.' Mr. Squeers, after following with his eye the action of Ralph's hand towards the fireplace, as if he were at that moment consuming the paper, drew a long breath, and said: 'Yes, but who's to bring it?' 'Nobody, perhaps, for much is to be done before it can be got at,' said Ralph. 'But if anybody, you.' Mr. Squeers's first tokens of consternation, and his flat relinquishment of the task, would have staggered most men, if they had not immediately occasioned an utter abandonment of the proposition. On Ralph they produced not the slightest effect. Resuming, when the schoolmaster had quite talked himself out of breath, as coolly as if he had never been interrupted, Ralph proceeded to expatiate on such features of the case as he deemed it most advisable to lay the greatest stress on. These were: the age, decrepitude, and weakness of Mrs. Sliderskew; the great improbability of her having any accomplice or even acquaintance, taking into account her secluded habits and her long residence in such a house as Gride's; The strong reason there was to suppose that the robbery was not the result of a concerted plan, otherwise she would have watched an opportunity of carrying off a sum of money. The difficulty she would be placed in when she began to think on what she had done, and found herself encumbered with documents of whose nature she was utterly ignorant; and the comparative ease with which somebody with a full knowledge of her position, obtaining access to her, and working on her fears if necessary, might worm himself into her confidence and obtain, under one pretence or another, free possession of the deed. To these were added such considerations as the constant residence of Mr. Squeers at a long distance from London, which rendered his association with Mrs. Sliderskew a mere masquerading frolic, in which nobody was likely to recognise him, either at the time or afterwards; the impossibility of Ralph's undertaking the task himself, he being already known to her by sight; and various comments on the uncommon tact and experience of Mr. Squeers, which would make his overreaching one old woman a mere matter of child's play and amusement. In addition to these influences and persuasions, Ralph drew, with his utmost skill and power, a vivid picture of the defeat which Nicholas would sustain, should they succeed, in linking himself to a beggar where he expected to wed an heiress; glanced at the immeasurable importance it must be to a man situated as Squeers to preserve such a friend as himself; dwelt on a long train of benefits conferred since their first acquaintance, when he had reported favourably of his treatment of a sickly boy who had died under his hands, and whose death was very convenient to Ralph and his clients, but this he did not say; and finally hinted that the £50 might be increased to 75, or, in the event of very great success, even to 100. These arguments at length concluded, Mr. Squeers crossed his legs, uncrossed them, scratched his head, rubbed his eye, examined the palms of his hands, and bit his nails, and after exhibiting many other signs of restlessness and indecision, asked whether £100 was the highest that Mr. Nickleby could go? Being answered in the affirmative, he became restless again, and after some thought and an unsuccessful inquiry whether he couldn't go another 50, said he supposed he must try and do the most he could for a friend, which was always his maxim, and therefore he undertook the job. 'But how are you to get at the woman?' he said. 'That's what it is as puzzles me.' 'I may not get at her at all,' replied Ralph, 'but I'll try. I have hunted people in this city before now who have been better hid than she, and I know quarters in which a guinea or two, carefully spent, will often solve darker riddles than this. Aye, and keep them close too, if need be. I hear my man ringing at the door. We may as well part. You had better not come to and fro, but wait till you hear from me.' 'Good,' returned Squeers. 'I say, if you shouldn't find her out, you'll pay expenses at the Saracen, and something for loss of time.' 'Well,' said Ralph testily, 'yes. You have nothing more to say?' Squeers shaking his head, Ralph accompanied him to the street door, and audibly wondering, for the edification of Newman, why it was fastened as if it were night, let him in and Squeers out, and returned to his own room. 'Now,' he muttered, 'come what come may, for the present I am firm and unshaken. Let me but retrieve this one small portion of my loss and disgrace. Let me but defeat him in this one hope, dear to his heart as I know it must be. Let me but do this, and it shall be the first link in such a chain which I will wind about him as never man forged yet.' Chapter 56